Hi everyone, in comments to videos I have previously put up, I've noticed that some people are commenting on the price of medieval swords and the fact that swords were very expensive in the medieval period. Okay, that can be true, however, I've done quite a lot of research into medieval inventories, that is essentially wills of equipment and things that were left behind in people's wills when they died. Equally, I've looked at coroner's rolls, which are the court cases of the time where someone's been murdered or killed, and they describe maybe the weapon that was used or the equipment that they were carrying. And I've looked at many other medieval English sources. So I've trawled lots and lots of mostly 13th, 14th and 15th century English sources to look at the relative values of different pieces of military equipment. And obviously I focused on swords as that was one of my main interests. And what really surprised me was that there was a massive variation in the value of swords in the 14th or 15th century. So I should point out, we're talking about the late medieval period here. In the earlier medieval period, so say up until about the 12th century, swords definitely were a lot more expensive and, relatively speaking, rarer, okay, because they were more expensive. And around the 13th, 14th century, the blast furnace and metallurgy in Europe and North Africa meant that sword blades became much cheaper to produce. Not only that, but remember that swords didn't just vanish into thin air when they got to a certain age. So by the 14th century, not only were new swords cheaper to make and cheaper therefore to sell and to buy, but also there were old 13th century and 12th century and 11th century swords and sword blades still around. As time went on, there were more and more old swords in circulation to be bought as old second-hand items. And in some cases, if you look at Ewart Oakeshot's works, you see quite old blades re-hilted in later periods, and sometimes reshaped, the points changed in shape and so on to make them still a useful weapon. And in terms of values, I kind of liken it to a car today, okay? So most people who have a job can afford a car of some kind. But if we were looking back from the future, 500 years, and someone said, so in the 21st century, how much did a car cost? Well, it's where do you start and where do you end? You can buy a car, an old crappy car, for, 150, 200 pounds. It might have lots of problems. It might be riddled with rust and be very unreliable, but it is still a car and you can still buy it and it will still get you from one place to another. But equally, you could buy a Bugatti Veyron or a Lamborghini or a Ferrari that will cost you hundreds of thousands of pounds, up to £1 million. And it was very much the same with swords in the late medieval period in England. I found swords literally described as old rusty swords in wills, valued at as little as 2 pence. Okay? Now, to give you an idea of what 2 pence was to a medieval English person, an archer, a professional archer, by the later part of the 100 Years' War, was paid 6 pence a day. So, aside from his living costs, if we ignore those, he could have bought 3 crappy rusty swords every single day that he got paid. Okay? Even a foot archer got paid 3 pence a day. So you could buy an old rusty sword for a day's pay or less. Okay? But at the other end of the spectrum, you have Henry V in about 1412, 1413, if I remember correctly. He had 12 swords made to be given as diplomatic gifts to other kings and rulers of Europe. And each one of those swords was valued at £2,000. And the £2,000 in Henry V's time was a colossal amount of money. I mean, I haven't looked at the value of building cathedrals and castles and grand buildings, but I'm imagining that £2,000 would probably build you quite a big building. Okay, so and you know, these swords, they had Spanish blades, we know, and we imagine that the hilts were probably quite valuable as well. Probably they had gold and silver and maybe some precious stones on them. So they were high status gifts. But my point really is that sword values is such a massive range from 2 pence to £2,000 in early 15th century England, that you can't really categorically say swords were expensive. The important thing to know is that in medieval England, and therefore in most parts of medieval Europe, probably even more so in places like Italy where they were making a lot of these swords, basically anybody who had a job could afford to buy a sword if they wanted one. And lots of people, lots of normal, regular civilian people owned swords and carried them when they went travelling. Thank you.